Hi, everyone. This is Dustin Hausner. I'm the Jewish Outreach and Program Director at the Wayne YMCA. Our Jewish program is funded through the Jewish Federation of Northern New Jersey. I'm extremely excited for today's guest. I've been listening to her podcast for quite a few years now. You'll learn quite a lot. I'm going to leave it to both of them to talk about it, but I'm really, really excited to have them both on our show. We have the co-host of the podcast, Judaism Unbound, Dan Libenson and Lex Rofeberg. So, gentlemen, it's wonderful to have you both on.
It's great to be
Thank
here.
you.
Thanks for having us.
Absolutely. So,
Usually we're on the shoe's on the other foot, and we're the one thanking the people for being here. So it's fun to be thanked.
No, like I said, it's a great pleasure for me to have you both on, and I can see you both color-coded and matched for your background. So I appreciate you both did the homework before the call today. So let me just ask very directly for anyone who's watching this who isn't familiar with, let's say, Judaism Unbound or, of course, Jewish Live. I was wondering if you both could talk a little bit about what are podcast and the Jewish Live show.
Yeah, I should note for your viewers that our backgrounds say Jewish Live, and that's a newer project that we've been working on that really started at the time of the coronavirus physical distancing. We could talk about that. The interesting reason is that that's our background is because we are in the process of redesigning the logo for Judaism Unbound. So we don't actually have a background for Judaism Unbound yet. But anyway, so but actually, I think that kind of connects in some ways to both projects, because in a way both projects happened quickly and without a sufficient amount of preparation, including preparing of logos. And and then you get stuck in a situation, then it's 4 years later and you're like, oh, I never really liked that logo. Let's actually have a process. But really what happened was with Judaism Unbound was that I had been a Hillel director in the past, and I have a whole backstory as well. My dad was a rabbi. I was always a kind of a black sheep, rebellious child who didn't like the things that were expected of me. And somehow I always felt like I ended up with a really great Jewish education, but I didn't like the day-to-day practice of Judaism as I had experienced it. And so I always had this feeling like, I think it's like how an engineer must feel. Like you kind of see that these parts could really do great things, but the way it's currently wired together is not quite right, and you just want to have this experience where you could like take the thing apart, investigate the pieces, and put it back together in a new way. I think that in a deep way, that's my experience of Judaism. And over the course of this professional career where I tried to be in it, I tried to be out of it, I always talk about it. I'm like Michael Corleone in The Godfather. They always say, I think in The Godfather 3, he says, every time I try to get out, they pull me back in, and I've tried to leave the Jewish community professionally many times and failed. And the time when I hooked up with Lex was really, I had gotten to this point where I felt like we were undergoing this enormous change in Judaism. Like it wasn't only me. Actually, one of the experiences that I had when I was a Hillel director is that I would tell parents or board members really about these things that we were doing for the students, and they would be saying, oh, I wish I had that. And I'm like, but you're an active member of the community. Like you're the president of your synagogue. You're on the Hillel board. Like what, this is for people who are like not really engaged in Jewish life. And they're like, no. But I realized that when my kids went to college, I realized it was never working for me in the first place. And I was just doing it for the kids. And so I started to feel like this wasn't just that some college kids weren't connecting to Judaism. This was that Judaism was in a serious period of transition. We can talk more about the nature of that transition, but long and the short of it was that I think I initially hired Lex to kind of be more or less a research assistant for this book that I wanted to write about the future of Judaism. And Lex did a few months of research, and Lex was doing amazing research, and then we were trying to put together the pieces, and we were saying like, we just don't quite have this book yet. We need to do more research, we need to do more thinking. And partly because I had a particular podcast that I loved and still love, although it's not on as much, that was about applying the theory of disruptive innovation, which we can also talk about to Apple Computer. I was really into this podcast, and I said, what would it look like if we had that podcast, but instead of applying it to Apple Computer, it would be applied to Judaism. So that was kind of the genesis of Judaism Unbound. It was part of like trying to figure this whole thing out about the future of Judaism, and also try to apply some particular theory from the world of innovation to Judaism, which is something that I think hadn't been done before. Lexa, you want to?
Yeah. So I want to emphasize, I don't want to add that much. I mostly want to like highlight, underscore whatever the right visual image is, things that you said. So when you say that these things sort of came together and we didn't think through the logo and all this, like, we're not being modest. I want to be clear. We really didn't know what we were doing. When I say we didn't know what we were doing, I mean that in two ways. One, we didn't know, like, we didn't have the skills for what we were doing. We started a podcast and neither one of us had ever done any kind of audio production at all. And also, like, we didn't know the what of what we were doing. We didn't know what it was. And so over time, it turned into a coherent-ish set of things, still ish for sure. And we've been able to retroject sort of a process onto it that makes it feel like it all made sense from the get-go. And I think it's important to say that because when we don't, like, I think we live in a Jewish universe and a broader universe that really takes preparation seriously and really takes, look, and that's important, but we just sort of jumped into stuff and hoped for the best. And it seems to have worked mostly. So, like, that's an important thing to say. With Judaism Unbound, when Dan says I was hired as sort of a research assistant for a book, like, I remember conversations with my wife. I was living in Mississippi, working for the Institute of Southern Jewish Life. I moved back to Providence, Rhode Island, where I was living with my then girlfriend, now wife. And she kept on trying to get a sense of like what I was about to be doing with this job. And I had no answer. It was like, I'm working for a thing where we're trying to make ourselves like a Jewish think tank. It's me and Dan. We don't really have anything yet, but like it's going to come together and be something. And so the podcast was the first like, oh, substance. Like this is a thing. Right. We're not just like talking with each other about the future of the Jews, which I love doing, by the way. Or at least we are talking with each other about the future of the Jews.
We are doing that.
But it's just official. It's like, we can do that and we can have the same like ranty phone calls with each other. And like now it's a thing and it's got a logo and people will listen. Okay. And I think that's an important teaching. Like I think at the time it was like overwhelming and weird and I felt like we were just jumping into some kind of void. But I think that there's something to that. And I think it even more after Jewish Live, which I'll go in a little bit to what Jewish Live is so that we cover both bases, the Judaism Unbound base being the podcast part. And the Jewish Live piece is newer. But like, I think that with Jewish Live, we had a sense for a while, and April Stern, who is not here with us today, was a major piece of this. She's a listener to Judaism Unbound, who'd been in touch with us. We had a sense that we wanted to create some kind of hub for Jewish programming online. We hadn't fleshed it out so much. We had just some initial early conversations. And then, boom, we had a situation through coronavirus where every Judaism was a digital Judaism, or any Judaism that is a collective Judaism beyond your own family is a digital Judaism. And so that meant that, okay, we kind of felt an obligation. We're already working in the digital Jewish ecosystem. I live in Providence, Rhode Island. Dan lives in Chicago, Illinois. We've been working for an organization that functions pretty much entirely online for years. And we've been in Zoom and we've been doing like, we're sort of here. And it's almost like we were taking on the commandment of welcoming guests, of Bikur, not Bikur, of Hakmasat Orchim. Like, we got to do this. This is our obligation. And so we tried to kick into gear and create this resource that is basically a ton of different kinds of Jewish programs, learning sessions, worship services, environmental programming, arts and culture programming online. That's all happening sort of on a rolling basis every day. And it's been really successful these first few months. But for us, it's really something that we think was necessary anyway. It's just that like this moment catalyzed it into being, and hopefully it will now exist long beyond, and not just us, hopefully this whole way of doing Jewish will continue to persist long after coronavirus.
Well, first of all, I appreciate you both explaining, obviously, how this Judaism Unbound and Jewish Life got created, but also just the honesty that this was something that was a concept of an idea, which then spurred over time into something. Because I think when people look at something like a Judaism Unbound, they say, oh, they must have had all the support and had their stuff together. So to hear from you directly that it was something that there was a passion, there was an idea, and you were able to make it into something, I think is very inspiring. I think that's a wonderful message. So I just wanted to highlight that for a minute. But let me ask, because Judaism Unbound to me is deeply fascinating in the sense that you have over 200 episodes. You've had many different types of interviews between leaders of different known organizations, grassroots. Two topics you talked about, and you did like a small series, which was interesting, is you talked about God and Israel particularly. And I want to just mention that because I feel like those are kind of the areas in Judaism where it's, you talk to your rabbi and then you talk maybe with the family, but you two weren't afraid to have that deeper conversation. I'm curious, and you could.
We were. I will say, so one thing to note about that. So we were scared to have those conversations, and for different reasons with the God one and the Israel one. And we were both scared, and like, an important thing is we had a podcast for, I think it was about 2 years or 2.5 years before we did those units. So we had 100-ish episodes of a podcast about American Judaism without having episodes specifically devoted to God and specifically devoted to Israel for a variety of reasons. One, and we talked about this in those units, funny enough, in those units of episodes. One, I think those subjects actually get too much play in American Jewish life. I think both of them we place in the middle of conversations where they're actually not always the center of people's Jewish experiences. I think we somehow believe that if people aren't connecting deeply to God and aren't connecting deeply to Israel, that they must not really be connecting to Judaism.
Right.
And I think that's entirely untrue. I think when I actually have deep conversations with most American Jews, a lot of them, like, they might be theists, they might be atheists, they might be somewhere in the middle, whatever. Like, God is not the top of their list of like what they're doing when they're doing Jewish. It's not about relationship with God usually. And by the way, for me, that's even with very traditional, like, there's other things happening with Jewish practice that are not always just focused on God. And similarly, Israel, like, we have so much discourse about Israel, both from a political lens and a cultural lens and everything. And it's like, I just find that there's even discourse about, oh my gosh, do people care enough about Israel? Do they care? And it's like,
right.
I don't think that the story is that people, look, I've been a member of organizations that do work around Israel-Palestine politics, but like, I don't think the story is that people are, becoming more antagonistic to Israel or something. I think the story is, it's not the centerpiece. I mean, it's just really not what most American Jews are thinking about when they think about Jewish. And so we put those units of episodes off for a very, very long time because we didn't want to privilege them. But at a certain point, we got enough notes from listeners, and we do take that feedback seriously, that like, we want to hear what your approach is to these. And what we did is we used those units as a way to open up broader conversations about American Judaism. It wasn't really about God. It was about, how do American Jews talk about God? How do we do this well? How do we do this poorly? What does it mean to have God language all the time? What does it mean if we moved away from that? What kinds of God are people interested in? Is there a non-dualist kind of God that we should talk to people about? Is there a more classic kind of, like, we had those kinds of conversations. And it was less like, oh, what do we think the divine is? And more, how does that play in American Judaism? And same with Israel. Dan, I'm curious if that's how you look back on this.
Well, I mean, like, on the God part, I would say, I wasn't scared to talk about God. I just wasn't all that necessarily interested in it. Meaning that, but I also, and I agree very much with how you put it, Lex. Like, I think there was interest, and I was interested too. And it was trying, like, the thing that I was concerned about, I think, in terms of God, is that Judaism Unbound is very much for people who feel themselves kind of on the periphery of organized Jewish life. By the way, a ton of listeners are like rabbis and people that are not on the periphery, but we pitch the show at people that are on the periphery, or that's our imagined listener. And I know there's a lot of our listeners. In fact, a lot of our listeners are people who are in the process of converting or have converted. I mean, it's actually quite fascinating. I kind of feel like a lot of people, and I would count myself among them, who feel a little bit like on the outside of Jewish institutions, tend to be because the institutions are kind of built around this idea that Judaism is a religion and it's kind of all about God in some way, even if it's that you don't believe in God, but somehow God is very central. And I didn't even want to have the topic, God be in a Judaism Unbound episode name, because I didn't want to scare anybody off. But I kind of felt that at that point, 100 plus episodes in, most people already knew what our orientation was, and they knew that if we were going to explore the question of God, we would do it in a Judaism Unbound way. And it turned out great. With Israel, I was very scared to do it. Lex was less scared. Lex wanted to do it.
I was pushing for it for a while.
Lex was pushing for it. But I felt like, well, I'm the one who has to do the fundraising. Not that we have so much funds raised, but I'm the one who has to sort of interact with the aggrieved funders and who don't like what we did or whatever. And I was very nervous, even though we were actually a small startup organization that didn't have a lot of funding. So in a way, we didn't have that much to lose. But on the other hand, I want to build this up, and I want there to be the potential. And I was afraid that if we did something on Israel, even if we thought that we would do it really carefully and thoughtfully, but inevitably somebody's going to be angry about it, and from one side or the other, or both, and you could say, oh well, if we've pissed off both sides, that means we've done it right, but realistically, if both sides stop giving you money, then you did it right, but you're gone, and so it's very complicated, and it was very complicated, and I was very nervous to do it. Especially since I think we both absolutely refused to do it in a way that would be different from anything else we do on Judaism Unbound. And the whole point of Judaism Unbound is that it's unbound and you can say whatever you want and there's no red lines of any kind, and what was fascinating is that, you could say whatever you want about God, nobody cares. But if you say something wrong about Israel, it's a disaster, and that just feels kind of off. I mean, it seems like if you're going to get all upset about Israel, you should also get all upset about God. I mean, it's also a central thing. So it sort of felt like Israel can't be the one thing that we're not allowed to talk about in the way that is just kind of exploratory and thoughtful, and that brings in voices from all sides. And so, but I felt that if we were going to do that, we were going to get in trouble. And it turns out, actually, I feel like it was an amazing experience for me, also as a Jewish leader, because we didn't get in trouble. I think that we did it really carefully. I think we did a great series. I'm actually so proud of that series. I think it's the best. I don't know if it was 10 episodes or whatever it was, but I think it's like the best 10 or 12 hours of thoughtful exploration about Israel's place in American Jewish life today that exists anywhere on the internet. I mean, I think I'm really proud of it. And I think it came out great. And I think that it's sort of a sign, I hope it's a sign to other leaders out there that, if you have a one-time panel discussion on Israel, that's probably not going to go well. You're gonna get. But if you're willing to take the time and willing to put in the effort to say, we're really taking this on sincerely as an exploration, and we're going to spend weeks on this, I think that would be a gift to the Jewish world. I'd love to see organizations all across the Jewish world saying, we're going to devote the next year to exploring this in a thoughtful way. I think that would turn the conversation, because what I learned from it is that you have to take time, but as long as you're taking the time and you have built up trust with the audience, that you can explore the things that people talk about as the third rail. And I was very excited about that, but it, like Lex says, I could only have gotten there after 100 episodes. It was not easy.
One of the reasons I wanted to bring it up, because as you said, you did many episodes when you got it, and I think for me there was a great surprise that you both decided to take those two subjects on, because normally in many Jewish circles, you feel there's a narrative to whoever you're having the conversation with. There's either the question of loyalty, there's the question of, what do you believe? And it's a very constructed answer. Whereas I found that your show, and as a listener, you've done such an amazing job having a diversity of guests and having them be informational and educational, that for you to do such a deep dive in a subject that is seen almost as a taboo or in many circles was fascinating. Personally, I think you guys did a wonderful job, and I think anyone who's watching should, of course, listen to all of Judaism Unbound. It might take you a while, but there's many amazing episodes. That series is really good, but you also do holidays. You also do a lot of different Jewish types of ceremonies and things. But let's go back a little bit about your audience, because you were talking about kind of the Jews who are secular, the ones who are converting, the ones who are kind of on that precipice between you're Jewish in many ways. It's that lightness in a sense. Have you found, out of curiosity, because you mentioned people send you emails and things, has there been kind of a consistency in what type of programming they're looking for you to do on the show? And also, is there certain types of episodes? Because I don't want to ask who your favorite guest was. I don't want you to get in any trouble. But is there a certain type of content that you particularly enjoy discussing on the show?
I think Lex, in terms of our audience, I think I don't know. It's a great question. I'm just trying to think if I like bias it with my own preferences, but because I feel like I'm tempted to say that the emails that we're getting from guests are very confirmatory of our interest, which is something like if the guest is somebody who is extremely open, meaning I actually saw one of our favorite guests. I don't want to say our favorite, but one of our favorite and recurring guests has been B'nai Lappi, who is a rabbi who has created a Talmud study center based on the queer experience, the LGBTQ experience. And I read in an article about her that was written by an educational thinker from the Jewish Education Project in New York, actually, and they were trying to sort of explain her teaching style. And they said something like, I think they said something along the lines, or I interpreted it as that she's like a public student, that she doesn't come up to the board and teach you something and tell you this is the right thing. She's kind of learning along with you. And of course, she knows more than she's letting on, but the experience is that she really is learning, and it's very sincere. Like, I think she really feels that. And when I read that, I felt like, oh, that's how I think of what I'm doing also, that. And I think that when we have guests, whether it's B'nai or other people who are in that same orientation, who say, yeah, look, I'm bringing some ideas here. I have thought about this, but I'm really excited to be pulled into this thoughtful conversation. And Lex and I tend to ask challenging questions. We ask a few softballs at the beginning to get the conversation going, but then we really try to sort of go in for the kill, and we're not trying to.
Don't tell my strategy. Don't tell everyone my strategy.
yeah. So like, we're not trying to, catch people. Like we love our guests, like they're, but we want to push them to think hard about tough questions so they're not just offering, like, we don't like it when a guest comes in and they're scripted, they have all their answers written out. So we want to, and we'll tend to push the conversation away from that so that we get the guest really thinking out loud on the show. Most people enjoy that. Most guests are okay with that. I think that's what the audience responds to. I think that what people are responding to, what these sort of people that have been on the outside of Jewish institutions are responding to, is the idea that there aren't closed pat answers. It's not like, we tend to see these books or websites about what does Judaism say about, death, whatever, as if like the answer is, 3 things, 1, 2, 3, but really what Judaism says is, let's think about this, here's some frameworks to help you think, right? And I think that a lot of people have experienced Judaism through like bad Hebrew schools or, mediocre synagogue experiences where somebody's trying to tell them that there's a right way to be Jewish. And oftentimes that, quote, right way to be Jewish doesn't sit well with them. And they're basically given a binary option, take it or leave it. And so they leave it. And I think that when those people encounter Judaism Unbound and they encounter conversations with people who are saying, it's complicated, let's talk about it, I think that's very refreshing and exciting for people. And certainly it is for me. I think that's what we hear from our audience. Lex?
Yeah, so I like that. And I also, and I don't think I'm disagreeing with you, Dan, but I want to name that, like, for us, some things are simple. Like, it's not all that we're interested in complexity and just like, let's think together and put, like, we do have agendas at play. And like one agenda I would explicitly cite, which you mentioned before, Dan, but like, it's very important to me. So there's 2 different audiences, right? There's like the full audience of anybody who listens to Judaism Unbound. And then there's like the people that we are thinking of in our heads when we are talking, and the people that we are most interested in communicating with, in affecting. Which, by the way, whenever I talk with people about speaking, like I think you have to have that image in your mind of who you're talking to, or else nothing. Like that's got to be your starting point. For me, like we're talking to a set of people who, like, the people that I would like to be insiders with us or feel like part of our crew are the folks that are outsiders of other Jewish institutions. It is explicitly important to me that we are filling a niche, that like there's an issue where certain segments of the Jewish population writ large are not centralized in most Jewish institutions. We could go down the laundry list of Jews of color, queer Jews, Jews with critical views about Israel, Jews like Jews in interfaith relationship. Like we've got the whole working class Jews. Like, and what we found, and we did a big survey. Like we actually have some data on this, not as much as one day we'd like, but like those people are listening to us, and a lot of them are. And when Dan and I get notes from rabbis and Federation professionals and others who are listening to us, like obviously we're thrilled about that, especially when they want to think with us about what it would look like to change their institutions. But like that's not really who we're talking to. Like we're talking to mostly like people who specifically have not been empowered as like titled leaders of Jewish life, whether that's through boards of director kinds of titles or professional kinds of titles. Like that's the people that are most important to us, because I think I don't want to say we're failing, but we've got a lot of work to do collectively as a Jewish people in making sure that those people are given springboards into leadership. Like we've got a lot of room to do that, because we haven't been, like most of what we're seeing across the Jewish world, across geography, across different kinds of institutions, is that rabbis, Jewish educators, cantors, Jewish nonprofit professionals, they're the ones sort of doing the work. And like one core theory point of ours is that it is specifically the people who are not insiders who come up with the ideas that catapult forward groups of people. Like it's not that like you educate people, like it's not that we're going to create better Hebrew schools and day schools and whatever, and like teach people more about Judaism from our Federation and JCC and Hillel and et cetera perspectives. It's that people are going to come around. Dan mentioned converts. Like I think converts are a great example of this. People are going to come with specifically other background experiences. We're about to, as we record this, it's about to be Shavuot, and we're reading the book of Ruth, which to me is like, Ruth is not a Jew. She's not an Israelite. This is my hot take, but like, I'm not even convinced that in the story she converts to Judaism, which even though she's like the archetype of a convert, like she is a Moabite, and she keeps on being called a Moabite. And she brings something.
And by the way, in the Torah, a Moabite is not allowed to become a Jew.
Right. Yeah. And so this comes after the Torah, and like some argue that it changes, but like it's a serious set of issues.
No, but I mean they're saying something radical.
Yeah, exactly. Because the Torah previously said that you couldn't possibly have somebody be a welcomed part of the Israelite crew, and then a Moabite becomes the matriarch of King David. It's a big deal. But like for me, the teaching of that story is not, wow, a person who was an outsider became an insider, and then from that we got King David and this whole, it's no, somebody that was an outsider, somebody that was not us, who thought differently from us, who saw, I don't know exactly how, the text doesn't tell us, but like was markedly different, brought her Torah to the people, and it worked, and we got a new moment in Israelite history. And by the way, I'm not treating this story as like literal history. No. For me, it's more important as like a literature, as a story. But like that's a whole meditation on the audience. Like I think we specifically spend a lot of time trying to make sure that what we do will feel resonant for a set of people who specifically don't feel comfortable at existing Jewish institutions. The last thing I'd say, because you also asked about like our favorite types of episodes, for me, I think that when we do like revisioning, you mentioned holidays, when we look at moments of the Jewish year or kinds of practices, and we really start from a blank slate and say, what could this be? Yeah. Okay, so Rosh Hashanah is a holiday. If we said nothing that is part of the Rosh Hashanah liturgy is going to continue, Rosh Hashanah is going to be an entirely new thing that contains some, that like is a continuation in some ways, but like is really different. What would that look like? To me, I don't see other people having those conversations. And I think that that's a niche that we're filling that is really pivotal. Because if we only do the like tweak work of, okay, how can we do Rosh Hashanah a little better, given that we're going to use prayer books that have been published, given that we're going to largely do the Hebrew liturgy that we've inherited, given that we're going to X, Y, and Z, go down the list of Rosh Hashanah practices, as opposed to like, okay, what do we want to mark a new Jewish year, or whatever it is that Rosh Hashanah is? By the way, the Torah does not say that Rosh Hashanah is a new Jewish year. The Jewish year is 6 months earlier. But that changed, and so we can change stuff too.
So let me ask you, because again, it's fascinating listening to you, because both of you are very fascinating people to listen to. But you know, you also just have this grandiose of knowledge, which is just, I want to just sit back and kind of let you two go at it. So in part, that's why I like the podcast. But let me ask, in regards to, let's say the synagogue, for example, and I know you've talked about this previously, but especially now with the coronavirus, where rabbis for many ways have been forced to do Zoom and different types of things. And there's a great questioning of the role of synagogues, especially in the last number of years, with many synagogues having to close or having to join like Reform and Conservative or so on and so forth. So I'm curious, from your interviews and also just from both your perspectives, if you think kind of the establishments of where we get that Jewish learning, which for many people think is the Hebrew school or the synagogue, if you think it's going to continue in the manner we're speaking, or if it's something that is going to either shift or evolve in some unique manner. So I would love to get both your thoughts on that.
Are you asking about education in particular, or the whole experience? So, well, yeah. So, you know, it's funny because some of these questions are there's so many layers upon layers of complexity to them. I mean, they sound like simple questions, and they're really quite complex, because I think that there's a fundamental question about the very basic nature of Judaism that's in play here. And that's been a central theme of our show from the very beginning, but it matters a lot. Like I talk lately when I've been giving talks, I've been starting with Albert Einstein's famous quote where he said, if I have an hour to solve a problem, I would spend the first 55 minutes making sure I was asking the right question, and only the last 5 minutes working on solutions. And I think that in some way, the question has to start with, where are we in Jewish history? Okay. Because if we think that we're in some period of Jewish history where, you know, we've hit a snag, we've hit a bump in the road, then it's just like, okay, so let's see if we can fix it. Let's see if we can smooth that out. If we think that we're in one of these periods of Jewish history that is analogous to the destruction of the Second Temple and the origin of Rabbinic Judaism from the year 70, right, then that's a different process. And we've been arguing that we're in the latter from the beginning of the podcast. I think that the coronavirus, the physical distancing and everything that we're experiencing now, I wouldn't say it confirms what we've been saying for 4 years. We still could be wrong. But it certainly, I think, gives people more of a sense of what it might feel like if we were right. You know, meaning that we can't go back to the way things were. What would happen there? Now, I'm saying that we haven't been back to the way things were for 200 years, but we've somehow been fooling ourselves into thinking that we are, meaning that American Judaism, as experienced by most American Jews, let's say non-Orthodox American Jews, it never really worked for them, for the most part. They were involved for reasons other than they were deeply moved by the content of Judaism. They were involved because in America, people were expected to be a member of a church, and so they should be a member of the Jewish church, right? I mean, they couldn't not be a member. There are all kinds of reasons why the American Jewish community looks the way that it does. And if we're in a period where I think what's happening is that those chickens are coming home to roost, and people are really asking questions like, why should I go to a synagogue for 3 hours a week to pray to a God that I don't believe actually listens to prayer? That doesn't mean I don't believe in God, but I mean, it means that how many American Jews really believe that prayer is effective? You know, and if I am not going to find that, you know, and if I'm not doing something that I think is effective, and I'm spending 3 hours of my week doing that, and by the way, the prosperity has something to do with that, although there are plenty of Jews who are not prosperous. Economists tell us that the more prosperous people are, the more they value time. And so in a world in which Jews are impoverished, 3 hours may not sound like a big deal, you know, but in a world in which people are more prosperous, they tend to be very, very precious. Time is very precious to them. And so they would much rather spend 1 hour and not 3 hours. And especially if I feel that the activity isn't really effective. So all that, we could talk about all that more, but what I'm suggesting is that if what we're really seeing is a profoundly different Judaism that might come out on the other end, and that's what I believe, then one of those possibilities is that Judaism is no longer transmitted from parent to child. That doesn't mean that if I'm Jewish and my child, that doesn't mean that my child isn't likely to be a Jewish adult. I hope that they will be. But I think that they, like everybody, is going to be a Jewish adult out of their own choice, not out of something that I'm going to do in their childhood, other than give them happy memories. Then you know, I just don't believe that. There's too much else on the table. And so I think that so what I'm actually interested in would be a complete reshaping of Jewish education, where Jewish education is something that adults do. And what we do for children is positive Jewish memories. And I'm not sure that children have to learn all that much as children. And what I see in the world of all the people that are converting, that are in touch with us, is that there's a tremendous capacity to only start your Jewish learning as an adult and be a very learned Jew pretty fast, because adults learn things really fast, whereas kids, you know, mostly forget what we learned in childhood. So what's it really accomplishing? And I want to put out a kind of controversial way of stating that, because I think it's important. I mean, people don't have to agree, but I think that they should disagree with the strongly stated view rather than, you know, some notion of like, could we just, you know, make the bar mitzvah at 15 rather than 13, which at the end of the day, like, in my opinion, is not solving the right problem.
Yeah, well, so that's a really important point. I totally agree that at the very least, the ratio of like focus on childhood education versus adult education has to drastically shift. And by the way, I don't say that like sadly or disappointed. Like, adult education is great. Yeah. I really like it. Like, I enjoy diving into whatever Jewish stuff, and that can be traditional Jewish stuff. That can be Jewish music. That's like, it can be the whole gamut of things. But I think what Dan's point starts to get at is that so much of Jewish life is driven by fear. The reason that we are putting so much focus on childhood education is because the presumption is, if we don't sort of get people, if we don't sort of capture the people when they're young so that they will connect to Judaism, then they're not going to in life. And like, will be endangered and our numbers will shrink. Like, that is 100%. And there are documents describing this from the mid 20th century approaches to Jewish education. Like, that is clearly the Jewish identity building notion. That's why you have to do it, because if you don't early, then you can't later. That's the idea. And like, I think that's such a self-esteem issue, and it presumes that Judaism just isn't that great or couldn't be that great. Like, I love, I often, I'm in an interfaith relationship, which one of the pleasures of that is that when I and my wife host various kinds of Jewish things, always it's a very diverse kind of audience. And it's so fun for me to see somebody who's never experienced a Passover Seder, because they're not Jewish, they're 25, 30, whatever. And like, wow, what a cool thing. Like, wait, so you're doing a scavenger hunt in the, like, after dinner? That's like a tradition from a couple thousand years ago. Like, you're like, there's all these symbolisms for food. Like, there's a lot of cool stuff that we don't even think is cool. We've just internalized this idea that Judaism's kind of crappy. And so we think that we have to give it to people early, because why would they ever be interested once they're sort of more sophisticated? And that's tragic to me. And it signals a bunch of really problematic things that I want to be done with. So that's number one. Like that. So that's like my gloss on what Dan said. The other thing I want to say is, you asked about, I don't know if this was the core of your question or like an aside of your question, but you asked about like the synagogue model, and whether that might evolve, whether that might change. To me, it's an interesting question, but I think we presume that the stakes of that question are much higher than they actually are. Like, I'm mentioning Mississippi a few times today. I guess my mind is there. I lived in Mississippi for 2 years. I was a member of one of the oldest congregations in the United States. If you were to break down the like percentiles of how old congregations are, this congregation dated all the way back to the mid-late 1800s.
Oh, wow.
There are some that are older, but like it's few enough that you can like name them. You can make a short list. And I say that because we seem to think that if synagogues in their current form went away, like Judaism would be in grave danger. And like, why do we think that? Like, this is one of the oldest synagogues in the United States, and it's 140-ish years old. So if it went away, if that entire model went away, that would mean that we'd have another model that, like, we've had 1.5 million other models. Like, I think we come at these issues with a set of like intersectional identities, and people are doing a good job of being aware how, okay, if I'm a white person, if I grew up Reform, if I grew up in this area of the country, like that's going to affect how I see Judaism. What we don't always realize is one of our intersections is we are 21st century Jews. Mm-hmm. And we think that whatever models of Judaism exist now, like we privilege those. So it scares us if there wouldn't be things that look like our moment, because we can't really imagine other moments. But the reality is, if you drew up the map of today's congregations and JCCs and whatever to somebody even 75 years ago, they would look at it and be like, what? Like, this is nothing like what they lived with. And 150 years ago, like, are you serious? There were barely any Jewish anythings at all in this country. Like, that 150 years ago brings us to 1870, pre-mass immigration from Europe. Like, everything has changed at that point. And what we had in Europe looks nothing like what we had here. Even though there were, in a sense, synagogues, they were not the kinds of synagogues like what we have now. So I'm happy to approach that question of like, are synagogues going away? Are they shifting? Are they going to merge? But it's like, I want us to recognize that if the answer is on the far end, I don't think this is the answer, but if the answer were all of it's going away, there's going to be none of those. And there's going to, like, the takeaway from that isn't, oh my gosh, Judaism is dead. We've lost. The takeaway from that is, I'm assuming there would be some new set of models. We're seeing early stage of that digitally right now, like what some of those models might be. But it's actually quite energizing for me and exciting to think about what it would be if we didn't have any synagogues. Not that I want them to go away, but just because that question allows us to consider, wow, what is our place in the arc of a few thousand years of Jewish history? Like, do we really think in 300 or 400 years that the world is going to roughly look like what it does now? If not, what an exciting project to be actively part of what creates that next stage, as opposed to just like passively living our lives and allowing inertia to push us in whatever directions.
Right, and the one thing that I just want to add, one example of that I think will be familiar to people, is just that, and I talk about this a lot in talks that I give, is that if you think about photography today, it is as ubiquitous, more ubiquitous than it was ever before. I mean, we take pictures constantly. I have one picture of the bird that I had for 7 years as a child. I have probably 100 pictures of my dog from last week. It's that photography has never been healthier. But the companies that dominated photography for most of its history, Kodak and Polaroid, are bankrupt. And other companies have taken on that mantle. So if you're a Kodak executive, you'll say this is a really sad story because, you know, photography moved from analog to digital and our company died. If you're somebody who just loves taking pictures, you would say this is the greatest time in history of photography. So what I want to suggest is that this could be the greatest time in the history of Judaism. And like Lex says, there could be no synagogues left on the other side of it. That is possible. Do we understand what the vision of that looks like? Not yet. But nobody 15 years ago could have foreseen, or, you know, a few people probably did foresee, but the vast majority of us didn't foresee that the way that photography would exist 15 years later is that it would be in a phone. You know, and if they had thought of it, if anybody had said to them, hey, we're going to have photography on a phone, they're going to be like, yeah, but I'm sure the pictures are going to be terrible. No, the pictures actually are amazing. So that's where some of the limits of our imagination are. And I'm not totally always sure like how to throw this thinking into the Jewish community, you know, because I want to say to synagogues, look, you don't have to be Kodak. You don't have to ride this train, you know, down to the bottom, but you're going to have to do things profoundly differently, most likely, if you want to make it. And I want to say to whoever is out there, federations, funders, anybody, to say, like, don't confuse the health of Judaism with the health of the current set of institutions that you're funding, because those are not equivalent. And, you know, I just really wish that there was like a more enthusiastic response to that idea. I think that there's some interest, there's some willingness to consider perspectives like that. But especially after what we're experiencing now, I still am not quite hearing the sense that like, gee, I never expected that we could possibly have anything like a social distancing. I never heard of that before. But now that this is, maybe it'll happen again in 2 years. Maybe it'll happen again in 5 years. We better get prepared for a profoundly new way of living Judaism. And that doesn't mean necessarily that every synagogue should have a streaming plan in their back pocket. You know, it might mean that we need new digital organizations that are going to take on a substantial mantle of Jewish life, even if we're not physically distancing. And then if we become physically distanced, they can sort of take on even more. And then maybe there's a new role, a new kind of institution that we're going to need in person. Of course, neither of us is arguing for a digital only Judaism. We're suggesting that in the same way that the printing press caused a major change in the way that Judaism was lived, because now you could read things out of a book that normally you had to get a rabbi to tell you what things were. And now, I mean, even just think of the Passover Seder, the fact that everybody has a book at their plate, that is an innovation that could only have happened after the printing press. Nobody could afford to have books at the Seder before that. So now that we're having a digital revolution, why shouldn't we expect an equally enormous change? And why don't, and that doesn't mean, just in the same way that books didn't mean that we didn't get together in person anymore, it meant that we did different things when we got together in person, and that would be the same here.
So let me ask you both, because it goes in line with what I'm talking about, but I think it narrows it in some sense about the question of education, but also the broader, the much more complex question of Jewish identity in general, which is, of course, a huge part of your show. And this is, I would say, a very American question because of some of the institutions I'm about to name. And for anyone who's upset that I didn't list you, I apologize. But, you know, for the sake of, you know, the Hasidic community, the Orthodox, Chabad, Modern Orthodox, Reform, Reconstructionist, Revisionist, I'm trying to think of who else, the Humanistic, you know, all these different Jewish movements, some have existed for a very long time, or like Reform had very American roots, and some of them really started in the last not even 100 years. So I'm curious in your standpoint, based on your interviews, because you've had guests who fit multiple ones of these boxes. When it comes to Jewish identity, do you think being part of any movement or any such identity is something that's going to potentially disappear? Or is it something that you think, because people like to be in a space with other people and to have some sort of commonality in what that Jewish identity means, that these movements might continue to thrive in some way, shape, or form?
So I think yes and no. It depends. The yes, both of them are deep. There's a deep yes and a deep no, and they come from different understandings of what a movement means. So I do not think. So present tense.
Yeah.
I think that the vast majority of American Jews already are not deeply committed Reform Jews, conservative Jews, renewal Jews, Reconstructionist Jews, Orthodox Jews. Like, I don't think that identity it relates to what I said before about God and Israel. Like, I think we have the wrong categories.
Please.
And I think that like people are taught when asked, what kind of Jew are you? Or like, how did you grow up? To answer with, oh, I'm Reform. Oh, I'm conservative. I grew up Reform. I grew up conservative. Like, that tells me very little. Like, I'm not, and that, by the way, I'm not saying that to throw shade at the movement. It's just like, they are really broad tense, and this is purposely, like, they are broad tense, and there are things that you can tell about somebody if they're like deeply Reform, if they went to the summer camps, if they did, like, there are affiliational identities that are deep, but it's a small group. And the rest of us, I think, we consider ourselves Reform or conservative or Orthodox or renewal or Reconstructionist, mostly because we've been taught that we have to have an answer to that question at the beginning of small talk, like, what kind of Jew are you? And those are the labels that make sense. I have started on Facebook. So in certain Facebook groups I'm in, Jewish Facebook groups, you have to give your frame of reference. Okay. So FOR, frame of reference, : and it's often frame of reference Reform, frame of reference conservative, and I have started putting other things as my frame of reference, because I actually think that my identity as like a Jew committed to Jewish pop culture is often the real frame of reference, more than like the fact that I grew up going to a JCC camp or in a Reform synagogue. I think the fact that I really like Jewish numerology and numbers, like, is sometimes my frame of reference more than any particular denomination. I think for some people, like, earth-based Judaism could be a movement that they are part of. That's not really a movement, but that's where the yes comes in. Like, I do think there's Jewish movements now. I think we're not noticing them. Like, there is a very deeply connected national network of people that roughly connect to Judaism through environmental justice, through nature, there's like a bunch of organizations, often connected to Hazon. They've got an umbrella group called Jaffe. Like, this is a real serious thing. There's a bunch of organizations, and people know each other. It's really a community, in the sense that people mean when they talk about affiliational identities. But when you ask people, what kind of Jew are you? I know nobody who says, oh, I'm an earth-based Jew. I would like to build a world where that's a reasonable answer that doesn't confuse folks, because we're teaching people that the way you meaningfully identify yourself are a bunch of labels that hold very little, that like tell very little. I think that, we're seeing more and more that there are learning Jews. There are people who live out their Jewish identity through study of text, I mean, we've got drastically growing organizations like Svara, B'nai Lappi, that look at Jewish learning through a queer lens. We've got Hadar in New York that do, not through a directly queer lens, but do another approach to deep Jewish learning. We've got all, like, what would it mean if we saw that rough set of organizations and ways of doing Jewish as a movement, and sort of put aside that the most meaningful movement is Reform, Reconstructionist, conservative, whatever. I think that what we're seeing right now is going to accelerate, because when you talk to people, once again, I base a lot of this on just when you have long, deep conversations with Jews, what actually do they care about? And I find that very few people say, I am really into my conservative Judaism, my Reform Judaism, whatever. Like, and this includes people that are part of those congregations. I find that when you actually talk to them, like, yeah, they go to that one because they like the rabbi, or because it's reasonably close to their house, or because it's the kind of service that resembles what they grew up with. But, like, do they ideologically feel committed? Not so much. And so that opens us up to a set of new ways of thinking that are deeper and that do communicate more, that I'd like to invest in building.
Is there anything you want to, or do you feel?
No, I think that I think that's a great answer.
So
I'm going to record you saying that, Dan, and put it after everything I say in the podcast. So I think that's a great answer. Comes after every.
This was all an elaborate plan just for you to say that to him. So this was all elaborate.
Right.
But no. So, and again, most of the questions that I try and ask, there's deep layers of complexity. Hence why there's so many episodes and why there's so many things on the subject matter. But let me let me ask, because obviously you two have been doing this for over 4 years. You continuously are learning, growing, and you have your own backgrounds. Is there an actual Jewish definition in the sense of, if you are saying that the literature can change, if you're saying that the movements can change, if you're saying everything to an extent becomes fluid, and obviously, as you both mentioned, if we're thinking original, what we think of monotheistic Judaism with what we have today, it's something no one could have necessarily imagined. So is there an actual one singular definition of what it means to be Jew or Jewish in this type of thing?
I think Lex and I agree
Yeah.
that the answer is no, but I think that we disagree a
Reframe it
little bit
different, yeah.
about some of the nuances about it. What I would say is something like this, and I think Lex agrees with this part, that descriptively the answer is absolutely there is not. There is not currently, meaning there is, and there may never have been. This is where we have a little bit of disagreements, but that basically there is currently not a way to be Jewish that is the right way. And I would say that the question of what makes something Jewish, I think, is a really important question that everybody, has been taught the wrong way to think about it in a sense that meaning that everything, and I'm not necessarily the world's expert in every Jewish practice, but I've heard this said by other people that are more expert than me that have said a really extreme version that say literally every Jewish practice that you can think of comes from a non-Jewish origin. And, some kind of practice that was happening among the Canaanites, among the Persians, among the Babylonians, the Egyptians, whoever. Meaning there's very, very little that is absolutely pure, if anything, that is absolutely pure as a Jewish creation. You could argue about that a certain way that it is now. I mean, like lighting Hanukkah candles, you could say, well, that's Jewish, but it has a non-Jewish origin. So it turns into something that's more recognizably Jewish over time. But like I've always joked about, like, I don't know why Americans are so allergic to a Christmas tree. Like the Jewish way would be just to say that the Maccabees planted a tree outside the temple after they liberated it, because like of course they did. In Israel, everybody plants trees all the time, so we know this, so of course the Maccabees planted a tree outside the temple when they liberated it, and that's why we have a tree at Hanukkah. And and we decorate it with all kinds of things that represent other Jewish glosses on that tree, whatever. We would come up with a story that makes it Jewish. That's how we did. And so if you take every Jewish practice that you can think of, that happened. So somebody wasn't allergic to the practice because it had a non-Jewish origin. Probably other people resisted it, and the people who wanted it won out. And then maybe those people who resisted it said, okay, we lose, you'll do it, but we'll tell you the story about why it's Jewish. And the people who wanted the thing, they're like, okay, fine, say whatever story you want, and that's how the thing emerges as a Jewish practice, right? So I think that what makes it Jewish, to my mind, is some kind of continuity, right? Meaning some kind of, it's not somebody that went to a desert island one day and had no contact with the world and then created something new and said, I'm calling this Judaism, and it had no relation to anything that came before. It's like, no, but I'm not sure that I can tell you, and I don't think anybody could tell you, what percent does it have to be, or how does it, it's really just this question of, do I believe that the people who are working on this, who are trying to live a Jewish life this way, are sincere in their belief that they are kind of carrying on and modifying various continuities with the past? And if so, then I think it's a legitimate form of Jewish creativity and experimentation. I would add one thing, which I think is maybe where Lex and I have a little bit of disagreement, is that I do think that there are these times in history where what is defined as Judaism narrows. Right. And so you could say that in the first century, Judaism and Christianity, or what the Nazarenes were doing, however you want to call what Christianity now is, back then, you could say that those were two sects of Judaism. Then they were. At a certain point, they diverged. At a certain point, you could still make the intellectual argument that Christianity is a form of Judaism, but really it's not anymore. And so I think that there are these times of expansiveness and there are these times of narrowing. I think that we are actually at a time of expansiveness right now, that we should actually have more ways of being Jewish. And at the same time, and it sounds a little bit like a contradiction, I am a very strong proponent of a narrow version, meaning that I'm saying right now, nobody's illegitimate in what they're doing sincerely if they believe that it's Judaism. But I don't care about a Judaism, for example, that doesn't take seriously the social justice tradition. And I kind of wish that those forms of Judaism will fail and, and just go away. And I wish that eventually Judaism will narrow back to be something that where some of the principles that I think are ancient, such as love the stranger because you are strangers, or that we're created in the image of God, so we should treat everybody in the image of God, or that we should walk in God's ways, meaning that when we become powerful and have many of the powers that we used to imagine that God has, that we therefore have the responsibility that we used to ask of God towards us. Now we have those responsibilities towards others. However you want to put those, but I want a Judaism that is about that. Right? I don't really care about much of the other stuff. And so like my dream is that one day, in 100 years from now, people will say any kind of version of Judaism that doesn't have, social justice at its core, well, that you could have said that was Judaism 100 years ago, but we had that divergence, just like we had the divergence of Judaism and Christianity, and that stuff isn't Judaism anymore, something like that. That's so my dog in the fight, like I have two dogs in the fight, right? One is that I'm trying to say this is a time where everything we knew before doesn't matter anymore, and we're now in this new world with lots, and we have to let 1,000 flowers bloom. And I really hope that my flower is the one that blooms.
Yeah. So yeah, Dan and I. So what you just said, with the small exception of like what your dream is for the future, I do co-sign pretty much everything that preceded that. Here, to go directly to your question, is there a Judaism? Am I free, like no? Yeah. There is not, like, I am very staunchly in the camp, and this, if I were to name my frame of reference like before, like my frame of reference would be Jewish studies, like academic Jewish studies, which has had a lot of really beautiful, interesting meditations, explorations on like what Judaism means. There's a whole book called Judaism by Daniel Bayarin. There's a book called Jew by Cynthia Baker that like unpack what these terms are and whether, like, the extent to which they're just sort of constructed over time. I don't think, like, to me, the question of like, is there a Judaism such that if we changed in too drastic a way, we would lose that thing, which is, that's, I apologize if I'm misquoting your question, but that's roughly how I hear it framed sometimes. Like, to me, that question presumes, like, if the answer is there is something, there is a Judaism, there is a Jewishness that exists in a real sense, that means that if something were to disappear from Judaism, that it would no longer be Judaism anymore. That if, like, pick your essence, right? Like, maybe Shabbat's the essence, maybe Torah's the essence, maybe, I don't know. But like, it presumes that if Shabbat was no longer here, or if Shabbat plus the book of Exodus were no longer here, or Shabbat plus the book of Exodus, like, then what, we could have a new thing, but it wouldn't be Judaism. And people use this in arguments with us sometimes, but with anybody who's saying we should change Judaism a bunch, because what they say is, oh, it's just not Judaism anymore. It might be a good thing. But I have a few arguments to that. One, every part of me physically, every part of my matter, my cells, will not be here in 7 years. I will actually be physically an entirely new human. None of my cells will still be here. They will cycle out. That's how human bodies work. I will still be me, to the extent there is a me. And by the way, to me, that is there a me is a real question. Like, I don't know if there's like a true self. I spend a lot of time interested in Buddhist concepts of no self. But like, the idea that like Judaism could experience a process where every single thing we presume is part of Judaism goes away and a bunch of new stuff appears, and we could still call it Judaism. And that's what we've done, by the way. Like, that's what has happened historically. And this isn't a radical claim. Like, we all look at sports franchises that existed 110 years ago None of the players on the team were on the team 110 years ago. None of the managers, none of the coaches were on the team 110 years ago. Often they've moved cities. Often their logos are different, but it's still one franchise. You can go to the Wikipedia page for the Golden State Warriors today, and you can go all the way back to the San Francisco Warriors, to the Philadelphia Warriors. You can hear the origin story. By the way, the Philadelphia Warriors were a spinoff from a team called the Philadelphia Sphaz, which was the South Philadelphia Hebrews Association. It's a very interesting Jewish story. That team is a continuation of the previous team, even though literally nothing about it, from the colors they wear on the court, the rules of the game have changed. Like, nothing is the same. So Judaism is like that. Like, Judaism in 100 years, to quote B'nai Lappi, will not be like what it is now. The question is, in what different ways will it be manifesting? And did we do our part to make sure that those ways are as profoundly meaningful and positive as possible? And so I am interested in the task of creating that reality, as opposed to trying to resist and saying, no, we're in this preservation game. We're like a copy machine, trying our best to get that 100% version of the previous copy, but you never actually do. And so if you copy it generation after generation after generation, it just gets worse and blurrier. And you get how copy machine. But like that's not what I want to do. And I draw inspiration specifically from the Jews in the past who have created wildly new kinds of Jewish practice. Those folks in the second temple time, those folks who were radical reformers in the late 1800s, those folks who, by the way, I'm not somebody who is like politically associated with like hardcore Zionism, but like Zionism was another manifestation of a beautiful attempt at a wildly new Judaism. I draw inspiration from those folks, and I can't be part of efforts that start from a point of like, how do we prevent ourselves from losing X, Y, or Z? Like, we got to be more ambitious than that.
So let me ask, because in many ways we've kind of deconstructed a lot of things that, you know, some people would say is sacred to Judaism. Others would say, you know, these are things that have to change because, as you said, times change, different things become priorities, and different ways of outreaching and talking to people changes these entities. I'm curious, from obviously the many episodes you've done, as well as your own personal experience, if someone, let's say someone's listening for the first time and wants to get an idea of where to start on what could be a Jewish identity, or someone who's been listening for a long time is pulling their hair out of everything that we're saying in this particular interview, but was curious to get an idea of what type of vision you're talking about, you know, is there specific resources you would recommend? Either it could be organization, I know you've mentioned a couple of books, or just individuals that you would see as almost a starting point to help with that sort of idea?
It's a good question. I would say the one thing that I want to say in reply to what Lex is saying is that, and this has been a long-running debate for us, is not that I necessarily don't agree with it descriptively, but I also feel like prescriptively, and this goes to your question, and this is why I'm saying it, is that I think it's hard for people to be inspired. I think it's hard for people to be inspired by an academic Jewish studies approach, right? Like, it's like, I haven't, when you say, there's some people who are. I mean, actually, I was one of them, right? Because I grew up in a kind of observant Jewish home, and I didn't have a belief that I thought was sort of expected in that community. And when I read academic Jewish studies for the first time, specifically about biblical criticism, I found it to be like something alternative that I could believe in. But that was in stark contrast to something that I was being kind of pushed away from. I think that the reason why, part of the reason why I talk about things like love the stranger because you were strangers as a core principle is because I believe that, and part of it is because I found that people are drawn to an idea like that. People want Judaism to be for something. And one of the episodes that we did, I can't remember if the content of it is where I would say this is where you should start, but we did an episode that was just a Lex and me conversation that I think the title of the episode is "What is Judaism for?" Right, Lex?
Yeah.
We were trying to get at this question, and I think it's a question that we've had sort of here and there a long time. And I think that others who have talked about it are Erwin Kula, Yitz Greenberg. I mean, these are also folks that we kind of see ourselves as like in their lineage. And B'nai Lappi, they come from the world of Klal, which is an organization founded by Yitz Greenberg and Elie Wiesel. It's really, some 30 years ago or so, that was really kind of in similar resonances in terms of really it's Yitz Greenberg who is the origin of the idea that we are in the later days of rabbinic Judaism and that we're on the cusp of something else. So Reb Zalman Schachter Shalomi of Jewish Renewal also talked about something analogous, which he called paradigm shift. And there have been others that have talked about versions of that. But I think that, so I think that listening to some of the episodes with some of those, you could call them elders, Yitz Greenberg, Erwin Kula, Art Green, and B'nai Lappi, who's less of an elder, but I think very much of somebody who's in that lineage and in that voice. And I'm sure there's some others Lex can add. But I think that for me, at least, it's about doing two things. One, first of all, saying I don't need to believe that Judaism is exactly what I've always thought it was up till this moment. So let me open my mind. Let me, unbind myself from that, and I can rebind myself to it. I'm not saying throw it away. I'm saying give it some space, and then say, and if it's not what I've absorbed, then what else might it be? And that's where I say, I'm not sure that for most people, saying it's academic Jewish studies, there have been a million different Judaisms, it's a history. I mean, some people are really inspired by that. I think a lot of people aren't. I think that if you are somebody who's more inspired by a mission, a sense of mission and purpose, then, I think that some of that is in some of those conversations. And I guess I'd also say that really, at the end of the day, I think what I want to invite people to do is to think about what you think the purpose is, what you think the mission is. But there has to be a purpose, because if there's no purpose, if it's just because we've had Judaism for 3,000 years and it would be a shame if it went away, I'm just not sure that's going to cut it. And, and I don't that excited about it myself, but if what we're saying is that we're trying to live a good life, we're trying to live the life that we're trying to live, and we don't know how to do it. We didn't have a great role model. Maybe we didn't know. We're struggling, and we're in a new situation where maybe we're more prosperous than our parents were, and we just never learned how to live a life of contribution where we actually had the means to do so. Then if I say, hey, well, there's this new form of Judaism here that, maybe actually draws from our tradition and gives you some sense of how you might do that, I think that might be really, really attractive to people. So I think that that's kind of where I'm hoping that people can kind of mine that. And I should note, by the way, that we are in the process of working on a book that is a collection of some of the transcripts from the podcast that we think sort of are the most significant in terms of some of these types of questions that you're asking. And that's a little delayed because of the coronavirus situation, but it's coming. And hopefully, we'll either create I don't know, we haven't even talked about creating a kind of an audiobook version of it where we actually do the shortened versions of those transcripts, or at least we'll put playlists on our website that have links to those particular episodes. I think that might be a helpful way to get people into it.
I mean, Dan and I do differ, and the only thing I'd like to say is I really do stand behind the inspirational power of scholarship. I really and I know, Dan, you're not arguing with that. I don't think you're an exception in the fact that Richard Elliott Friedman's, who wrote the Bible, had more than just an intellectual effect on you, but one that in many ways had a huge effect on the rest of your life. I think in general, one of our biggest, most pressing problems in both Jewish life and Jewish studies on the two ends is that they are so separate from one another and that we're not integrating them. And I think I have had so many experiences of deep personal transformation from works that are theoretically academic, in quotes, that are much more than that. And so and Dan, I know you're not arguing with that, but I really want to push all of us to look for meaning in spaces that are not seen necessarily as like spiritually focused, because many of them end up being that. For me, in terms of shouting out specific episodes, yeah, I think you captured a lot of them. I am most interested in episodes that break people open, that like break thinking. And because when something breaks, we have a human impulse to try and reconstruct it. I mean, this is reconstructing Judaism. Reconstructionist Judaism comes from that idea that like there's something you have to be constructing, because the way we've been taught it isn't quite right. We have to deconstruct, reconstruct. For me, some of the episodes that do that most effectively are Juan Mejia's appearance on our show in episode 57, I think it is. So it's called Becoming Jewish on the Web. It's not so much about the web, actually. I mean, it is about that, but it's about how it focuses on how groups of people in South America and beyond, South America, Latin America, beyond that, have been finding Judaism and both become deeply excited by it, often converted to it or rediscovered their own ethnic roots to it, a mixture of things, and themselves played a key role in starting to contribute their own twists on what Jewish even means. And I think Juan Mejia does a great job of sort of breaking an assumption in us. It certainly did that for me. Barbara Tita is somebody that I like to cite on this. She's also one that we're featuring in the book that Dan mentioned, but her episode is called, I think, Not Your Rabbi's Judaism. And it sort of names explicitly how we think of what Jewish is in this very narrow way that was defined by a small group of people. It's not a wrong way. It's just one way. But we have a set of presumptions about what Judaism is that are very limited, and that if we allowed ourselves to think beyond that, to Jews in Kaifeng, China, that have a rich, over 1,000-year history of connecting to Judaism in wildly different ways, to other kinds of Jews that are not who we think of as defining what Judaism is. When we break that open, I think something powerful happens, because it gives us license to be the creators of Judaism. That's what I find inspiring about the Jewish studies stuff, is that if there isn't an essence eternally to Judaism, that means that we in each generation define it. And that gives me and you and Dan and all of the people listening to this a huge amount of power. It means that we are actually the molders. We're not receiving a sculpture that's already done and trying to polish it and make it as pristine as possible to then pass to the next people. We're getting a bunch of clay that was shaped in certain ways and that we get to shape. And then we'll pass it and it'll get destroyed. Like, we've all seen a kid with like, they'll break it and then they'll remake it. And I see that as inspiring. I get what you're saying, in that it's sort of complex and less intuitive than just Judaism stands for a commitment to justice. And well, like, those are things I want to be committed to. But for me, one of the drawbacks of what I think is the dream is that we have to say there is no principle that in and of itself is the point. But in each generation, we can name one as our point, and we can create huge ecosystems that are devoted to we were strangers in Egypt, and we refuse to allow anybody else to be that way. So it's like, I think we get to a similar conclusion, but how we conceptualize what's happening is different.
Well, this is one of those discussions where literally I'd be happy to sit with you over hours to talk about a variety of different subjects, and maybe we'll do another one. But for now, I would love to. I would feel remiss if I didn't ask you, where is the best place for people to listen to you, to contact you? Obviously, as you mentioned, you have a book coming out. You have Jewish Lives. So if people are interested in either learning more about what you do, or they just want to take a look just out of great curiosity, where's the best place for them to find you?
Lex, that's your cue.
Yeah, so I'm the one who does our little outro in episodes that mentions this. Okay, great. I'll even do it. I'll do it basically word for word.
Please.
Okay, so thanks so much for listening, everybody. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and there are a wide variety of ways for you to be in touch with us. Here are all of them. First, there are our 2 Facebook pages, not 1, 2 Facebook pages, Judaism Unbound or Jewish Live. The Jewish Live Facebook page is all one word. We have 2 different websites, JudaismUnbound.com and JewishLive.org. We have our Twitter handle just for Judaism Unbound, which is @Judaism Unbound. And we have our email inboxes, which we really enjoy receiving emails at. Our 2 email inboxes are dan@JudaismUnbound.com or lex@JudaismUnbound.com. I won't do the plug for donations, but if you want to donate to us, that's another thing you can do. You'll find where to do that if you want. Yeah.
I hope you'll both stick around for a few minutes, but for everyone watching, gentlemen, I need to thank you both so much for this wonderful discussion. I think it was very thought-provoking, a lot of things to listen to and a lot of things to think about. For you watching, I want to say I hope you stay safe, stay healthy, of course. Dan, Lex, thank you both so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.